A few years ago, I noticed something about myself that bothered me for months. Every time I made a decision, even a simple one, I felt the need to explain why I had made it. To a friend, to a coworker, sometimes even to a complete stranger who had never asked. Then one day, someone asked me a question that changed everything. He looked at me and said, "Why are you explaining this to me? I never asked." I fell silent. Because he was right. I didn't need to justify myself. I had simply done it out of habit. That day, I started observing people differently, and I noticed a pattern that exists everywhere, in every culture and every era. The people with the most authority are often the ones who explain their decisions the least. Not because they're arrogant, but because they've understood something that most people never discover in their entire lives. Every time you explain why you did something, you're doing one very specific thing without even realizing it. You're placing your judgment into someone else's hands. You're giving that person the power to decide whether your reason is valid or not. And from that moment on, you're no longer the one in control of the situation. They are. Think about that for a moment. When a child asks their parents, "Why do I have to do this?" and the parent begins justifying every rule one by one, what usually happens? The child doesn't become more obedient. The child becomes a negotiator. They learn that every rule is open to debate, as long as they can come up with a convincing argument. The exact same thing happens between adults. Every explanation you give opens the door for someone to negotiate your decision, and most people open that door hundreds of times a day without ever realizing it. Before we go any further, I want to give you something. I wrote a guide that explains in detail how to regain control in situations like these, whether in conversations, at work, or in your relationships. If you'd like to receive a free excerpt, simply comment the word "value," and I'll send it to you directly. It's completely free, takes less than 2 minutes, and it can genuinely change the way people perceive you. Now let's return to the idea of strategic silence, because it's far deeper than it first appears. Look throughout history. The people who left the strongest impression were rarely the ones who spoke the most. They were the ones whose words carried weight, because they didn't give them away freely. A man who talks constantly diminishes the value of everything he says. A man who chooses his words carefully becomes, almost without trying, someone people naturally listen to. There's an enormous difference between silence born from fear and silence chosen deliberately. The first comes from anxiety. The second comes from mastery. And it's this second kind of silence that builds genuine respect. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine two men working at the same company. The first one, every time he makes a mistake, spends several minutes explaining why it wasn't really his fault, why the circumstances were difficult, why people should understand the context. The second man faces the exact same mistake and simply says, "I understand, I'll fix it." Then he gets to work. Which one inspires more confidence? The answer is obvious. Yet in real life, most people instinctively behave like the first man, because justifying yourself relieves immediate anxiety. It temporarily eases the fear of being judged, but little by little, it destroys your personal authority. There's a fascinating psychological mechanism behind all of this. When you justify yourself, your brain is trying to eliminate an immediate source of tension, the fear of judgment. But it's only a short-term solution that creates a long-term problem, because every explanation silently reinforces the idea that your decisions require someone else's approval. And once that belief settles into another person's mind, it rarely disappears. This is where everything changes. The people who naturally command respect aren't necessarily smarter, wealthier, or more charismatic than everyone else. They simply realized, at some point in their lives, that their decisions don't need a courtroom. Before we continue, I want to tell you about something that personally helped me through this transformation. Because this isn't only about the words you use or the attitude you project. It's also about your presence, the way you carry yourself, the way you dress, the way you take care of yourself. The authority you project often begins long before you ever open your mouth. There's a store called IsabellaCruzU.com, created specifically for men who want to improve their style, their confidence, and their personal image. It's no coincidence that the men who naturally command the most respect also pay attention to these details. If you're interested, I encourage you to take a look. There's absolutely no obligation. It's simply a resource I've personally found valuable. Now, let's get back to our topic, because there's an essential distinction I need to explain. Otherwise, you might misunderstand everything I've said so far. Stopping yourself from constantly explaining your decisions does not mean becoming cold, distant, or disrespectful toward others. This isn't about ego, it's about discernment. There's a tremendous difference between explaining something out of respect because someone has a legitimate connection to your decision, and explaining yourself out of fear because you're trying to avoid being judged. A team leader who explains the reasoning behind a strategy isn't justifying himself. He's informing his team because that information helps everyone move toward the same objective. But if that same leader starts defending every decision each time an employee questions it after it's already been made, he immediately weakens his authority. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Here's a simple test you can start using today. Before explaining one of your decisions, ask yourself one question. Am I sharing this because this person genuinely needs this information in order to act correctly? Or am I sharing it because I'm afraid they'll think less of me? If it's the first reason, speak, explain, it's necessary. If it's the second, pause, take a breath, then simply say, I've made my decision. You'll be amazed at how much that single sentence, without any explanation afterward, changes the entire dynamic of a conversation. There's one idea from this video that I especially hope you'll remember, because it's probably the most important lesson of all. Power never has to prove itself. It simply becomes evident. The day you stop trying to prove your worth through endless explanations is the day people truly begin to see you differently. That doesn't mean it'll be easy. If you've spent your entire life justifying yourself, your brain will resist this change. It will tell you that if you don't explain yourself, people will think you're arrogant. They'll misunderstand you. They'll walk away from you. But in reality, the opposite usually happens. People don't distance themselves from someone who doesn't constantly justify themselves. They distance themselves from someone who constantly signals uncertainty through endless explanations. Because uncertainty is contagious. If you doubt yourself, others begin to doubt you too. But when you're calm about your own choices, that calm becomes contagious as well. Now I want to tell you about one final element, one that very few people truly understand. Learning to stop justifying yourself isn't simply a communication technique. It's an internal transformation. Because you can't permanently stop explaining yourself to other people if you still spend every night explaining yourself to yourself, replaying every decision, questioning every choice, searching for reasons to convince yourself that you are right. The real work begins there, in the silence of your own mind. The day you make a decision and no longer feel the need to replay it 100 times in your head is the day you no longer need to convince anyone else either. It's a long process, but it's a process that changes everything. Your career, your relationships, and the way you see yourself. Before we finish, I want to touch on one last point that ties directly into everything we've discussed. The way you take care of yourself every single day. Because confidence isn't built only through your thoughts. It's also built through your daily habits. The way you dress, the way you care for your appearance, the way you present yourself to the world every morning. That's why I want to mention once again the resource I told you about earlier, IsabellaCruzU.com. It's a space created for men who want to build an image that reflects the inner confidence we've been talking about throughout this video. Because sooner or later, inner strength and outer image always come together. If this video made you think, if you recognized yourself in the habit of constantly justifying your decisions, I want you to do one simple thing before you leave. Leave a comment. Tell me about the last time you found yourself explaining something you never actually needed to explain. I'd genuinely love to know whether this idea resonated with you the way it resonated with me. And if someone comes to mind while you're watching this, someone who constantly apologizes, someone who feels the need to justify every little decision, share this video with them. Sometimes a single video can spark an awareness that someone has unknowingly been waiting for years. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, this is where, week after week, we explore the invisible forces that shape power, influence, confidence, and respect between people. These aren't abstract theories. They're practical observations you can apply immediately in your everyday life. And if you enjoyed this video, leaving a like truly helps me reach more people who need to hear these ideas. Before I go, there's one final thought I want to leave you with. There comes a specific moment in every man's life. The moment he finally realizes that his value is not measured by the number of explanations he gives, but by the quiet consistency with which he stands behind his decisions. That moment may come when he's 20. It may come when he's 50. Some men never reach it at all. But today, you've taken one step closer to that moment. The next time you feel the urge to justify something that doesn't need justification, remember this simple sentence. Silence, when it is chosen rather than imposed, speaks louder than any explanation ever could. That tiny difference, almost invisible at first glance, is what separates those who are quickly forgotten from those who earn lasting respect.